Hello, and I want to welcome everyone. I'm so excited. We have 58 people and counting registered for this Lunch and Learn, so that is just wonderful. Thank you all for joining us to learn about pretrial detention and the criminalization of poverty. I'm Karen Colson. I'm the Secretary of Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice, and we educate people on important topics like this Lunch and Learn, and we advocate for improvements in our communities. Women's Voices Raised has an upcoming program on Thursday, March 14th at 7 p.m. the Center of Clayton. It's entitled Creating Environmental Equity at a Local Level, Show Me Green Schools. So please go to our Women's Voices Raised website to register. It is an in-person event, time to reconnect and to get to know new people, and we hope to see you there. Okay, on to today's program. The Women's Voices Raised Task Force on Criminal Legal Reform has been working to educate our community on the problems with our pretrial detention system. Shockingly, about 80% of the people in Missouri local jails have not been convicted. Money and resources determine who waits in jail before trial. For those fortunate enough to be able to hire a lawyer, most pretrial jail time is avoided, since the person can also afford bail. The opposite is true for those who cannot afford bail. Here to talk to us today about pretrial detention and the impact it has on lives and communities is Insha Rahman, Vice President for Advocacy and Partnerships at the Vera Institute of Justice and Vice President at Vera Action, where she leads the development of advocacy priorities and campaigns. She is a nationally recognized expert on bail reform and criminal justice, and prior to joining Vera, she was a public defender at the Bronx Defenders. Just as a point of process, I would like to ask everyone to please put your questions in the Zoom chat or the YouTube live stream chat. We will have time once the presentation is finished to answer questions. Now I'd like to turn this over to Insha.
Thank you so much, Karen, and all of you for having me here for a chance to just really have a conversation. And so, as Karen said, I will present and share some background and information, some stories, because I've been doing work on bail and pretrial detention for 2 decades now. But I really encourage your questions, your reactions, your reflections. And one thing I really hope we get out of this is what can we do? What can each of us do in our own roles to make this world a little bit more just, more fair, and as a result, deliver more safety to our communities as well? So as Karen mentioned, I actually got my start as a lawyer, as a public defender in the Bronx. And as a baby lawyer, you got sort of the worst shifts, the night shifts. And in the Bronx, the courts were open from 5 p.m. until 1 a.m. And the kinds of cases that you would get as, sort of like the runt of the pack were the ones that frankly made me just the saddest, because it was somebody who kept getting arrested for not having $2 to pay the subway fare. And so they would, it's called hopping the turnstile here in New York, where you just jump over and you hope the cop doesn't catch you, because when they do, they'll give you a ticket, they'll pick you up, they'll bring you into central booking, and then I will see you 24 hours later. And as a public defender, I did thousands of those kinds of cases. Somebody getting arrested for having a little bit of marijuana or heroin, somebody getting arrested for loitering, which was basically they're homeless and sleeping outside a local business, and the store owner would, not knowing what else to do, call the police, and then I would see the person in the courts 24 hours later. And as a public defender, there was one common theme, even though I represented thousands of people with different stories, different sort of, personalities, different reasons of how they came to be. But one thing that was common to every single person I represented is that they didn't have money to be able to have a lawyer of their choosing. And mostly they were there, especially on the low level cases, and that's most of the cases that come through the courts. They were there because they didn't have a home, and therefore any kind of drug use, like smoking a little bit of weed, would happen outside. or they were, sleeping in the front of a store because they don't have a roof over their head, or they don't have Medicaid or consistent health care, and therefore their mental illness went untreated. Those are the things that we saw day in and day out. And I can't tell you enough that both I was glad to be the person who's there, standing sort of between the system that honestly is designed to crush people like my clients, and also feeling incredibly helpless that the best I could do was, give a little bit of money out of the fund that we had at a public defender's office, give them a Metro card so that they could actually swipe and get on the subway without getting arrested again after they left the courtroom, or sometimes because they had 30, 60, 100 convictions on their record because they had been through this cycle again and again and again. They would plead guilty to 20 days in jail, 30 days in jail, sometimes 60 days in jail. And what does that get anybody? Nothing really, because here we would be again 6 months later going through the exact same thing. And, to talk about the issue of bail. So in the courtroom, you hear what the charges are against the person who you're representing, and either the district attorney, who's sort of standing there, on the table across from me as the public defender, would either say, here's a plea offer, your client can take it, or I'm going to request bail. And oftentimes what would happen when the DA requested bail, sort of like, well, what's the bail for? It's got nothing to do with this person and what they can afford. And the idea of bail historically has been an incentive to get somebody to come back to court, to have a skin in the game, as they call it. But when my client has literally $0 in their pocket, what kind of skin in the game actually lets them get out and come back to court? They just can't meet that bail, right? And so that's when you'd often talk about, like, could we do 5 days jail instead? Can we do 20 days jail? Could I get my client into a program where we can address their mental health needs or their, addiction needs? And it's just this, you weren't negotiating from a place of power, and you certainly weren't negotiating in the interests of safety or the betterment of this person or our society overall. And I think that's really important to remember as I then start to talk about policy and pretrial detention, to be like, we're talking about everyday human beings, and we're talking about a system that has existed for several hundred years in this country, where money and not safety is what determines who goes home or who stays in jail after an arrest. And fundamentally, that is just, to me, sort of mind-blowing how we live in a world where that actually is the case, that it's about wealth and not safety, where key decisions are made about a person's livelihood and well-being. So I hope that just is important sort of grounding context, because as Karen said, the majority of people in jails in Missouri are there because of money bail that they can't afford, pretrial detention. But that's true nationally. It's not just a Missouri problem. It's a problem in our country overall. And while it feels sort of big because it is a national problem, there are very local solutions as well. And so I'm excited to share some of those. So let me put up my screen and I will share. Hopefully I can pull up PowerPoint. Give me just 1 second. And Karen, since I can see you, can you just give me a thumbs up if everybody can see the screen? Yep, thank you. So what I want to talk about is some fights that I've been in on bail reform and passing especially legislation. And then I'm sure, as you all know, there's been a lot of backlash to pretrial justice and to bail reform. And I want to share some lessons learned from the field of having worked on this issue for the better part of 2 decades. So the first thing I want to say, though, is the backlash that we feel. And, I'm curious how many of you, if you can do a show of hands, if I can see you, or even raise your Zoom hand. I'm assuming all of you are in Missouri. How many of you have heard something bad about New York bail reform or bail reform in general? See Karen's hand. Susan, I can see you, not sure. But see, I bet a number of you are like, I've heard something. I don't really know much about New York bail reform maybe, but I know I've heard something and it's not good. And here's the thing is, nothing triggers emotions like issues of crime and public safety. And I start here because whenever we talk about criminal justice reform and reforming the bail system, What's underlying it is that every reform that we pass and that we push for has to involve public safety, because it doesn't matter how you vote, where you live, the color of your skin, how old or how young you are, how much money is in your wallet. Everybody deserves to be safe and everybody wants to be safe. It is the most sort of cross-partisan issue I know. And nothing triggers emotions about worries of crime and safety than when we talk about criminal justice reform in this country. It is just a long-standing challenge and a cross to bear. And I actually think we have solutions to manage the backlash, turn down the temperature and the politics on these issues so we can actually talk about good, smart, and necessary policy. But I do always want to point this out is our perception of crime and safety is not actually based on facts. So for many, many years in this country, 20 years, crime has been going down. It went back up during the pandemic. There's a lot of reasons why, we can talk about them. But even in a place like St. Louis that has historically had some of the highest homicide and rates of shootings in the country, actually just last year, St. Louis was at like an all-time low for the city in terms of the number of shootings and homicides. There's been a real drop in crime. But again, if that's where you live, chances are you're still thinking crime's pretty high here. And it's because two things drive our perception of crime and safety. One is the media and the coverage that we see on the nightly news of that one awful incident that happened, or that's on the front page of the newspaper. And the other is politicians talking about crime and issues of crime. And so most people don't know the statistics, but they have heard that politician talking about it. They have seen the nightly news. And so every year when people are asked, do you think crime is going up or down? Even though the statistics tell us crime is going down, people tend to say it's going up. And so it's really important to remember there is just a deep emotional component to this issue. And I always start there to name the thing, because otherwise you're sort of left being like, I hear you on all this policy reform and change, but what about safety? And I think it's really important to lead with safety, because people want safety. They also want a system that's accountable and that works. They also want justice. So when it comes to bail reform, like I said, getting my start as a public defender, I did thousands and thousands of bail hearings. And as I mentioned before in that example of a client arrested for not having money to pay for subway fare, and the prosecutor, it just always seemed there was like a going rate. You never asked for less than $500 bail, because if you ask for $50 bail, that's kind of spite bail. But you asked for 500, and then it sort of went up, and it had nothing to do with the person or their ability to pay or their skin in the game. And that had been our system in this country for time immemorial, until New Jersey back in 2014 ran a ballot initiative. So everyday people got up and voted to eliminate the cash bail system that existed. And instead of having money, to have public safety actually be the determining factor that judges consider when somebody is arrested and standing in front of the court. And so in 2017, the new bail system in New Jersey went into effect. And the results were pretty remarkable. So this just compares before 2017, before bail reform in New Jersey went into effect, and then just 2 years after, what happened? So you can see the jail population in the state of New Jersey before bail reform was 15,000. By bail reform going into effect, the jail population literally declined almost 50%. And I know when I say that, sometimes people are like, well, wait, so what impact did that have on public safety? Because that's a lot fewer people behind bars. So it turns out it had no discernible effect on crime rates or public safety in the state of New Jersey. And what we also saw is even though people no longer had to pay money, it was that the judge would decide, you're free to go. Maybe we'll have some services, some monitoring, some supervision, or you're going to stay in jail. But the people who were released without having any money to put down, they ended up coming back to court at the exact same rate. So before bail reform, when people had to pay money in order to get out, almost 90% of people came back to court. After bail reform, when people were just released, they didn't have to pay any money. 90% of people came back. So we know taking money out of the equation, that whole skin in the game sort of argument that people won't come back to court if they don't have to put some money up, if they don't feel pressure, simply not true. A whole state took away money bail and it turned out fine. And what we also see is, a good measure for what impact is bail reform having on crime is when people are released, how often do they get rearrested for a serious offense? And look, we know, and I know this from my days as a public defender, if you're charged with low-level offenses like a turnstile jump, there's nothing about being released that necessarily fixes those circumstances. So I'd often see people come back and they were arrested again for shoplifting. They're arrested again for drug use. They're arrested again for other minor violations, which aren't minor to the shop owner who has to deal with it, or they aren't minor to the person themselves. But instead of holding that person in jail, what we could do if they're released is get them connected to services, get them connected to treatment, actually get them, housed and stable, because that actually took care of the underlying driver and the underlying problem. And so what you saw when you took money out of the equation in New Jersey is rearrest for the serious offenses, the things that really do worry us for public safety, assaults, robberies, things like that. The rearrest rate remained the same. There's 13.7% before bail reform, 13.7% after bail reform. Now, what we know from New Jersey is that bail reform is working, and there has been any number of articles written about it to say, by all accounts, from politicians to the media to researchers to everyday people, they think that this is a better system. And, I had asked earlier, and Karen, you raised your hand, what have you heard that's sort of negative about bail reform in New York? And you were like, I've heard something. I'm curious, and again, just raise your hand if it's true. Have you heard anything negative about bail reform in New Jersey? I'm going to assume no. Yeah, right. You shook your head no. And it's because what New Jersey did really well is they talked to the media, they talked to politicians, they made sure people understood what was behind bail reform, what were the statistics, what were the numbers. When the one bad case happened, and it always happened, they immediately talked to people to sort of do a debrief of what happened there and how can we prevent it happening the next time. So in my view, bail reform in New Jersey is an example of how to do it right. But, when New Jersey bail reform first went into effect, it wasn't that smooth. In New Jersey itself, these are the kinds of articles that were running in the local paper. Botched bail reform. Nobody's afraid to commit crimes. Cops and victims blast overhaul of the New Jersey bail system. And I say this to say, here we are, over 5 years later, Karen, you sitting in Missouri, hadn't heard anything bad about bail reform, but always locally there will be backlash. And again, the way to manage backlash is to say, hey, media stories, reporters who are running these stories, come talk to us, come look at the data, come talk to people who have benefited from not having to put money down, and instead were able to go home, back to their jobs, their families, their children. Let's have a real conversation about what is working and not just sort of believe the hype. Now, what shifted public opinion in New Jersey? So what they did really well is they released data on what's happening. So every month you could see from the court system itself, who was getting released, who was actually being held in jail, what about pretrial services and monitoring and other kinds of supervision? What we saw was a tremendous amount of unity and collaboration among stakeholders. So what New Jersey did really well is their Chief Justice of their Supreme Court was a big proponent of bail reform, and he got up himself whenever the sort of backlash started to say, here's why I still support bail reform. It doesn't mean we got everything right. We'll look at the things we need to look at, but I stand behind this. And other law enforcement stakeholders, sheriffs, judges, prosecutors also said, I support bail reform. What we also saw was a tremendous amount of responsible reporting by the media. So certainly there were those stories like the slide I just showed before of the backlash, but that was few and far between because the media really took it upon themselves to be responsible in their reporting about bail reform. And then what we saw also is there were calls for rollback, and they continue every so often. They sort of they rear their heads in New Jersey, but we've seen legislators who are looking at the data, who have great unity and collaboration among other stakeholders, who are looking to the responsible reporting by the media. And they're sort of staying the course and saying, again, we can't be driven by backlash and perception. We need to be driven by data and evidence. So, I am based in New York. I worked on bail reform both in New Jersey and New York. And Karen, as you raised your hand, lots of people who don't live in New York, who live in all other parts of the country, have heard a lot about bail reform in New York. So I want to start with the statistics. What did bail reform in New York do? It didn't go as far as New Jersey. It actually didn't take away money bail entirely. It just took away money bail for low-level offenses. But we saw the backlash was immediate. And as I said, it's politicians and media that really drive the public perception about crime and safety, as well as criminal justice reform and bail reform. And we have a mayor who was calling bail reform, calling out bail reform and saying New York is a laughingstock because of our bail laws. And what we see, though, is when you look at the numbers, they're pretty similar to New Jersey. So when bail reform went into effect in 2020, here's the before and after. So the jail population across New York State was over 21,000 people. As a result of bail reform, it dropped to about 40% of that. So again, many, many fewer people in jail. Court appearance rate, when you took money bail out of the equation for those low-level offenses, went up 2 percentage points. And then you can see rearrest for serious offenses, the kinds of cases that actually trouble us when it comes to public safety, basically remained the same. So it's clearly not the evidence and the data that's driving the backlash and the negative perception of bail reform in New York. It's something else. And what it actually was in New York was the bail bond industry had put together a really smart campaign online, talking to legislators, frankly, giving donations to elected officials and candidates who are running for office, and basically sort of insinuating their position and painting bail reform as bad. And so why does the bail bond industry care so much? Well, it's a $14 billion industry, and we are, being America, one of 2 nations in the entire world, the other is the Philippines, that actually has a private for-profit bail bond industry. So the challenge here is when you eliminate money bail, you actually, for the bail bond industry, take away their source of income and how to turn a profit. So folks are like, well, why were they organizing so hard? It's because they were fighting for their industry to remain. And places like New Jersey being successful, New York by the numbers being successful, they learned a lesson to be like, we've got to fight harder. Now, when it comes to New York, I just want to point out something about the backlash and the media. Again, there were stories every single day about the one terrible case of somebody getting released. And it wasn't as if a new case happened every day. It's just that one case took up 3 weeks worth of the media cycle. And you can see sort of like as these colors get darker over time, it was the percentage of New York City registered voters who said, I am very, very worried about crime and safety. And it was just bright orange by the time we got to 2022, after 2 years of relentless backlash to bail reform in New York. And so again, public perception matters. How it's shaped isn't based on the numbers, as you saw. What it's shaped by is how much is the media and politicians, how much are they talking about this particular reform? And what this slide shows is when Eric Adams, Mayor Adams, started his campaign, he started talking about bail reform at every turn. Then you saw media mentions of bail reform literally go up through the roof. And that's how you get to the kind of backlash that we have today. And so again, it's about politics versus policy. And I think it's such an important lesson for those of us who care about being active in politics and making sure we elect leaders who pass good policy to sort of separate the two, right? And what we saw in New York is because politicians actually, when they got attacked, Democrats mostly, for supporting bail reform, they either went silent on the issue, they didn't remind voters, why did we need to pass bail reform in the first place? Why should public safety and not wealth be the determining factor of who gets released or who stays in jail? They just literally sort of tiptoed away. Or, and I think this is perhaps even worse, they actually walked back their support for bail reform. And what that did for voters is sort of instilled doubt. Like, do you know how to govern? You just were championing this law. Now, a year later, you're saying, uh-oh, we went too far. Makes me question your competence as an elected leader. And it also then misses an opportunity to remind voters of why we need to pass good reform so that we don't criminalize poverty and so that, again, public safety and not wealth determines our bail system. And so I raise this because, we saw in New York, like in a place that most parts of the country would say that's about as blue as it gets, right? Well, even in a very, very blue liberal state like New York, this kind of political backlash has real consequences. And we saw literally entire swaths of the state, Long Island, which is the outer suburbs of New York City, sort of experience a red wave of Democratic politicians losing and Republican politicians taking their place based on fear-mongering about bail reform. So there's also other places that we've seen this come up. And another example I give a lot is in Harris County, Houston, Texas. And again, Harris County did bail reform for misdemeanors, took away money bail, had a huge impact on public safety. It was good for people to stay out of jail on low-level offenses. It gave them a chance to connect to services and housing, get jobs, all the things that actually are crime fighting and keep us safe. And it actually led to a real decrease in arrests, as well as the jail population. And so, again, we saw a lot of backlash. That's Governor Abbott saying like bail reform has been the worst thing that could happen to Texas. And it's these liberal cities in our otherwise red state that are undermining public safety. So I want to, before I get to what can you do, I want to end with a story of like how we can actually do bail reform in addition to New Jersey, but in another place that really works, to remind us that like even though the backlash feels intense, there's actually a real opportunity to get this right. And even amidst backlash, we're seeing places get it right. And that's Illinois. And Illinois passed bail reform in 2021. It went into effect just last year. And 2022 midterm election cycle, and I imagine this is a group of folks who are very active, both in local and state and national politics. You all know that was a huge election cycle. It was really sort of an important moment of, are we as voters and concerned people in this country going to stand up for democracy and what is right for protecting women's rights? Or are we going to allow for extremism to take over? And even in a place that, again, most people think of as very liberal and blue, like Illinois, the backlash to bail reform on the 2022 midterm cycle on the campaign trail was immense. The GOP, and I don't mean to be partisan here, I'm just sort of narrating the facts on the ground of what was happening during the election cycle. The GOP in Illinois spent $40 million running ads against Governor Pritzker on down to state legislators, calling them bad for public safety, saying that they're going to be responsible for blood on the streets if this new bail law goes into effect. And unlike New York, where Democrats sort of ducked the issue and, tiptoed away from bail reform, Governor Pritzker and all the state legislators who had passed bail reform actually stood their ground. And they said, you know what? Here's why I passed bail reform, because public safety and not wealth should be the determining factor in a pretrial system. And you have legitimate concerns about crime and safety, but we're not going to address issues of gun violence or shootings or carjackings by rolling back bail reform. If you blame the wrong cause, you miss the right solutions. We need to talk about the real causes of gun violence, of assault, of carjackings, of other kinds of crime that have people worried, and find the right solutions. And by doing that on the campaign trail, for one thing, November 8th, 2022, everybody from Governor Pritzker on down to the state legislators who passed bail reform, they all won re-election comfortably. And we know that matters. For those of us who work with candidates and work with elected leaders, that's a real consideration for them. So that fear that they would have to pay a political price for championing bail reform was put to rest. And what we saw is because these politicians were talking about why bail reform was necessary, standing behind the law, what we also saw in a public opinion poll in late November 2022 of Illinois voters, they were asked, how do you feel about the Pretrial Fairness Act, Illinois' bail reform? And 60% of voters said, I feel neutral to favorable about the law. So it basically kept public opinion and public perception of bail reform positive, to have elected leaders and the media sort of responsibly talk about the issue and not fearmonger. And I think that's really important because New Jersey, 2017 felt like a different moment. If you think about yourself 5, 7 years ago, we were talking about crime a lot less than we are today. That was just a fact. I think that's true for all parts of the country. Certainly was true in my life, certainly true for my family that lives in Texas and Ohio and other parts of the country, where if I have a conversation with them today, we are talking a lot more about crime and a lot less about criminal justice reform. And so even in a moment where we are facing difficult headwinds, a place like Illinois is a great example. And it doesn't just happen. It is that there is deliberate organizing. There are people like yourselves who are saying, I'm not going to give in to the fear mongering. I'm actually going to ask real questions about what is going on. What are the policies that we should be supporting? What can I do to make sure that there's responsible reporting? What can I do to make sure that local and state legislators know that we have their backs when they support good policy that they should champion that makes our communities more safe, more just, and more accountable? And so before I turn it over to you all for questions, reactions, reflections, I just want to leave you with so what can you do? And one thing that I think a lot of people don't know, and I'm curious how many of you have actually sat in a courtroom and watched bail hearings, but courtrooms are public spaces. They belong to all of us. And most of us have not been in a criminal courtroom unless we had the misfortune of being arrested or having a loved one get arrested and having to go there, or we work in the system. But you can walk into any courthouse where they're having bail hearings, and you can actually just sit there and watch. And I highly recommend, if you haven't done that, to organize a bunch of folks to go. Maybe reach out to the public defender's office or a lawyer that you know and say, hey, can you take us there? Can we watch for an hour? Can you explain to us what's going on? Because it will remind you of why are we fighting for reform, and why is the current pretrial system and the money bail system we have just so wrong and so unjust and so ineffective. And a number of cities, and I don't know if there are any in Missouri, but I bet somebody on this call will know, there are these court watch programs, which are organized often by volunteers, and literally it's sort of watching either online or in person and documenting what's happening in court. And that kind of accountability for a system that works is really, really important. And again, is a great way to be connected and to actually be able to sort of give of your time and your own passion and commitment for making sure we advance both safety and justice. There are bail funds all over the country, including, I know of a couple in Missouri, and these bail funds help people who don't have the $250, the $500 to get out so that they can go home to their families, get a job, get their lives sort of more stable, and break the cycle that led them to being in jail in the first place. And so those bail funds do, in my view, life-changing and life-altering work. And you can give $5, $25, $2,500, but any amount actually really does matter. And then I've spent a lot of time talking about the news and reporting, and all of us have local news outlets. We watch the nightly news. And another thing that you can do, if you hear or see a story where you're like, this just doesn't feel like it's accurate, there's a lot of sort of emotion being played upon, reach out to that reporter, have a conversation and be like, I'm a concerned citizen, and I really care that we are telling accurate stories about crime and safety and criminal justice policy. And I've had folks who I know have said, okay, I actually did that, and I had a great conversation with that reporter, and they got in touch with local criminal justice experts, professors, others, because you know who reporters have on speed dial when they want to tell a story? It's law enforcement, local police, and it's the prosecutor's office. We need many more voices contributing to these stories, like experts who study criminal justice trends, who understand the policy, advocates, people who are actually impacted by the system, who have gone through it. Those are all voices that should be in those stories. And so you can actually take a step to make that happen, and it's incredibly impactful at a local level. And then there's a number of places that have passed local ordinances on bail reform. And again, it's like talking to your city council, it's talking to the county legislature, it's talking to the mayor's office, it's pushing during budget season, and every single place has a budget cycle for more investment in pretrial services and services that help people actually, get support that they need if they're released. And frankly, it helps judges to feel like I have an option other than just letting this person go and knowing I'm going to see them again 2 days from now, or maybe I won't see them at all until they get arrested the next time, and saying, let me put you in jail. Actually advocating for money for more pretrial services and more court interventions is hugely, hugely impactful. And then at the state level, there's a lot of work happening right now on bail and bail issues, and I would say a lot of it is not good. I know Missouri has for a long time had different sort of, bills going through the legislature that require judges to set money bail on certain kinds of offenses. And they're offenses that I think every single one of us would say, it doesn't really feel like an issue with public safety. That feels like a criminalizing of poverty, or maybe it's not, but it just seems silly to sort of require somebody to sit in jail unless they can make the money. And that's a lot of what we're seeing right now. And actually, again, talking to your local legislator about this is hugely impactful, because who are they accountable to? All of us. And so if they hear from us, I really support these kinds of policies and I don't support these, that's the difference that makes a difference. So I would love to hear from you all, what questions you have, reactions, reflections. Many of you are sort of nodding as I'm talking, so I know that this is stuff that you've already thought about and are deeply involved in, and would love to open the conversation.
So Ellen, if Ellen Wentz has been kind enough to be monitoring our chat, and Ellen, if you could go ahead and give some questions that showed up there.
Sure. Women's Voices member Carol Prombo asked the question, the issue of qualified immunity for police officers is widely discussed, but not the total immunity that prosecutors have. When innocent people are accused of a crime and detained pre-trial, how much of a factor is total immunity for prosecutors in such inappropriate pre-trial detention? That's a mouthful.
That is a
for me.
mouthful. So I'm sure many people on this call know about qualified immunity, but just the one sentence of it is the idea of qualified immunity is that government actors need to feel like they have the freedom and leeway to act and carry out their official duties. And all of us make mistakes in our job. Nobody is perfect. But qualified immunity protects police officers, prosecutors, other government officials, that if they make a mistake on the job, but it is not done maliciously or intentionally, they cannot be sued or held accountable for it. That's what qualified immunity is. The obvious problem with that is, how do you prove malicious intent? How do you prove intent, period? Because it requires somebody to be honest with you about what they intended to do. And very few people are good enough to say, well, I actually really intended to do this or that, when they have made a mistake, and a mistake that has devastating consequences for people's lives. And so there's been a real movement to end qualified immunity for police officers, so that police officers can actually be held accountable when they wrongfully arrest somebody, when they engage in misconduct, when they engage in brutality. And that has been a huge, huge fight. To the person who asked the question about prosecutors, I'm so glad you raised it, because nobody in the public sphere talks about ending qualified immunity for prosecutors. They basically have a blank check. I have worked in criminal justice reform for 25 years. I'm trying to think of a prosecutor who was actually taken to court or held accountable by having to pay a fine or resign from their job for misconduct or holding somebody in jail and asking for bail wrongfully. And the truth is, the problem is, again, part of the media. I mean, so practicing in New York City as a public defender, when a prosecutor didn't ask for bail and somebody got out and they did something terrible and that fact pattern happens, that prosecutor and that judge and everybody is on the front page of the New York Post. There's an equivalent wherever you live, right? I have yet to ever see on the front page of anything, or even buried like right at the back of the newspaper or in a story, the prosecutor who asked for too much bail or the judge who set too much bail and somebody was falsely sitting in jail for months, years. That never makes the headlines. And so that's part of the problem. And again, it's why I always say, one of the things we can do is reach out to reporters and encourage them to report responsibly, because that's the only way we're actually going to get at this issue of qualified immunity and making sure we're all held accountable. And I'll say we all make mistakes. I've worked with many, many prosecutors. I do not think the vast majority of prosecutors are looking to harm people when they do their job. But the incentives in prosecutor offices are, in my opinion, the wrong ones. The prosecutors who get promoted, who get rewarded, who advance in their careers are the ones who secure convictions, not the ones who seek the truth and seek justice and a just outcome for both victims and people accused in their cases. So that is another way in which I think we really have to change the system in order to get at prosecutors who don't feel pressure to secure a conviction, who don't feel like my livelihood is dependent on actually, frankly, harming other people.
Thank you. And I love what you say about reaching out to the reporters. And Stephen Siegel asks, you may have to add to this. He says, any involvement with restorative justice programs? I don't know if you, go on.
Yeah, Stephen, if there's anything you want to know specifically about restorative justice programs, or please feel free to chime in. But restorative justice programs, and there's some great restorative justice programs in St. Louis as well that I'm happy to point folks to, and I'm sure across the rest of the state. A very good friend of mine and somebody I admire very much, Mike Milton, started the Freedom Community Center in St. Louis, and it's an incredible restorative justice program. So restorative justice is this idea that accountability and repairing the harm done should be the central focus of what happens in a case, as opposed to punishment. And so when somebody gets a jail sentence or a prison sentence, we're not rehabilitating, we're not actually repairing harm to the victim, unless, maybe there's some satisfaction in knowing somebody is sort of, paying for their behaviors, but there's nothing that actually puts the victim back together or helps to sort of account for the harm that was done to them. The idea of restorative justice is the person who has committed harm will acknowledge the harm that they have committed. They will do that in a way that actually is meaningful to the person that they harmed, and then they will actually take action to repair that harm. And so I had a case with a young person who ran by an older woman and took her bag, knocked her over. She not only broke her arm, but also suffered a concussion. It was really, really, really traumatic. Did that kid mean for all of that to happen? No. Did it happen? Yes. Should there be accountability? Absolutely. Under New York law, that is a robbery in the second degree. It carries a minimum of 3.5 years in prison. Does that 17-year-old benefit from going away to prison for 3.5 or more years? I think most people would say no. And so when we reached out to this victim, she said, you know what I really want? I want what he did to me to never happen again. I want him to never, ever do that to anybody else. And I was like, well, I think we have a way to get to that. And so this victim, who I think is pretty remarkable in her courage to take a chance on a thing that the system doesn't usually do. She agreed to do a restorative justice program with this young man. They met several times. He really apologized. I would say the first time I watched it and I was like, that doesn't feel very sincere. And then frankly, after several months of getting to know her, understanding her, who she is as a grandmother, as a person, the last time I watched him apologize, it was so sincere. And you sort of know he's just not going to do this again. So when it comes to public safety, is that kind of a program where he had to not only get to know this person who he harmed and sort of confront the damage that he had done, but also be in school, be in a program, like actually commit to sort of like improving himself. All of that, I would say, is better accountability and better for safety and better for justice than him sitting in jail for 3.5 years.
It's a wonderful story and excellent answer. Susan Glassman would like to know what motivates people to return to court if there is no bail.
Oh, it's such a great question, Susan, because I completely understand when people are like, well, if I don't have any skin in the game, why would I go back to court? So For one thing, I can tell you again, as a public defender who's represented thousands and thousands of people, I could tell when somebody was going to come back to court, and I could tell when they weren't. And when they would is because they believed that there was something serious or of consequence in the case. And so I could tell when I met somebody if they're like, these charges are, excuse my language, BS. I think this is unfair. I think this is unjust. I think there is no credibility to this. I was like, I might not see you again. When they felt like this is a process where there is, in fact, like a real charge against me, I understand that it is serious, and I've been treated with respect by my lawyer, by the court, by the judge, people show up. Again, I'll go back to stories, but I represented a man who is homeless, who literally like lost everything he had when he got arrested because, police arrest him. Nobody plans to get arrested. So his cart was with him with all of his belongings, disappeared. So I was like, I'm probably not going to see you again. But we had our first court date. And in fact, he showed up really early. He was the first person in the courtroom with his little cart sitting there. And he waited until his case was called. And our case kept going on for 7, 8 court appearances. He was there with his cart. And I actually asked him, I was like, I got to say, most of my clients who don't really have a lot of stability, they don't show up. And he's like, well, this felt like a really important case for me because I felt like you took it seriously, the judge took it seriously, so I felt like I should take it seriously. And I'm like, and so the research also shows, as I, showed you earlier with New Jersey and New York, you don't need money, people get it, they come back to court. But I really think that bit of like, when you take it seriously, when you demonstrate respect, that's what makes people feel an investment and an obligation to do the right thing and come back to court.
Thank you. Karen Francis, who her son's also a public defender. She would like to know if you worked with data related to immigration and immigrants being sent to New York and Chicago.
Yeah, Karen, thank your son for the good work he does.
Thank you for what you do. I'll tell you a story. His first case, his wife called and said, Karen, you're not going to believe what he's doing. I said, what? And he said he went to Goodwill and he's pressing a suit for his client. And his client was so appreciative. So,
yeah.
But thank you for what you do, and I'll be quiet.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. I will say, from knowing a lot of public defenders, from having been one, it's much more than being a lawyer. You just are like, what do we need to do to get you back together? I can imagine his client was having an interview or something like that, and you need to look good. That's a wonderful story. So yes, I mean, the work that my organization, the Vera Institute of Justice, does is we work to end mass incarceration, fight for immigrants' rights, and help to build safe, thriving communities. And so that intersection of, sort of the criminalization of immigrants as well is something that we work on. And we have seen, the sort of the fear mongering, frankly, about migrants bring crime, all of that just go through the roof in these past, sort of year and a half, 2 years. And I live in New York City, where that is really a narrative that is just front and center right now. And, we've been doing some work, and some of the work I do through our 501c4, so our more political arm, is I talk to elected officials and candidates about what do you say to advance good policy around issues of safety, accountability, and justice, both in the criminal, legal, and the immigration systems? And then what do you say to manage the politics of this issue? Because what we've often seen, and the sort of conventional political wisdom, is if you as a candidate or elected official, if you're tough on crime, if you're tough on immigration, people think that's what wins. Turns out that's actually not true. So I'm imagining many of you on this call are like, I don't need to hear more tough talk. What I would like are real solutions that actually work to advance safety, advance stability, advance security. Turns out, like, you're nodding and you're right. That's what the general public wants to see as well, including independent voters, including, and this surprises me always in our polling, moderate Republicans. They want, I think, a lot of the same things that others want, which is, again, safety, security, accountability, justice. And so we've been doing polling that shows if, as an elected official, instead of sort of adding to the fear mongering and the concerns about migrants taking jobs, migrants bringing crime, if you say, you know what, we can all come together and we can solve this problem. This nation is a nation of immigrants, and immigrants have always been part of our communities, our families, and our economies. And there are jobs, so let's work on getting work permits for them. There is housing, let's work on connecting people to housing and stability. And let's work on solving this problem instead of throwing our hands up and fear-mongering and say there's nothing we can do, right? And so turns out we actually tested in a poll that message, and in a place like New York where people are worried about the influx of newly arrived migrants, it turned out that message of we have real solutions and not the throw our hands up, we can't handle, the we have real solutions actually polls better with voters. And so we've been going around talking to the mayor's office, to others, to say there's a better message you can adopt. And you know what? The added bonus is it makes you look can do. It makes you look like you're competent and that you know how to govern, as opposed to saying this is overwhelming, there's nothing I can do. So I think there is actually a real opportunity for all of us who care about advancing good policy, both in the criminal, legal, and the immigration front, to really take this issue of newly arrived migrants head on and say, instead of saying, close the border, throw your hands up, to say, hey, let's work on getting resources together so that we can handle this issue, because it is hard when there are suddenly 10,000, 100,000 more newly arriving. It's not an insignificant problem, but there are solutions to it that work. And again, this country has welcomed newly arrived immigrants and migrants and newcomers in time immemorial. This is actually not that different if we're willing to put our heads together and solve the problem.
Thank you.
That was the last question submitted, Karen.
Okay. Does anyone else, you could raise your hand on the Zoom, have a question? This has been, to me, a wonderful, wonderful discussion. Insha, thank you so very much. And I really wanted to thank everyone on the call for their interest in the topic. And to let you know that Women's Voices Raised, our task force, everyone would love to have you as a member. So if you're not, please go on our website and join. And we hope that, you all advocate for improving our pretrial detention system. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Karen, and thank you to all of you for taking the time to listen, learn, and all the incredible work you do.
All right. Take care, everybody.